Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. I wish I could really see all of your faces, but this is one of the things that has happened in the last 2-3 years, that we've gotten used to very different views of the world. And what I'm seeing is all of you from the top of the class, I suppose, from somewhere in the gallery. Some of you probably already know what Hyderabad Urban Lab does, but what I will do is to quickly walk you through some of the slides which have been selected with no particular reason, except that they are all among the many different fun things that have happened at HUL. So Hyderabad Urban Lab is an organization that began in 2012 as a program of a trust, and then after 5-6 years we converted that into a non-profit company. These are both legal forms. They could be either operated as non-governmental organizations, can run either as trusts, as societies, or as non-profit companies. So at the moment we are a non-profit company, which basically means that we can make profits, but we are never allowed to declare dividends. Nobody will be able to make money out of the organization. Whatever money we make has to be spent on the purposes for which the organization has been set up. In the last 8 to 10 years, we must have seen about 50 to 75 young people pass through the organization, having spent about anywhere between 3 months to 3 years. Some of them have ended up in Ivy League universities. Some of them have ended up in practice. Some of them have ended up in smaller organizations elsewhere. It's a hub. We began to think about Hyderabad Urban Lab as multiple communities of practice, and that practice could be an engagement with the city through music, through writing, through planning, through politics, through pets, all kinds of things. So one of the things that we always valued is the work that we do with interns who spend 3 to 4 months, and during which they do some work with the organization, some work to learn new skills, but they actually end up doing some really fun projects. So just to give you a flavor of what those kinds of projects might be, we had one intern work on trying to figure out how stray dogs choose their friends, where do they sleep, where do they breed, and he was making maps of the movement of stray dogs in neighborhoods in the city, which led him from explorations of the street at different points of time during the day and night, to all the way to the rabies death ward in a public hospital, to anti-rabies vaccine manufacturing companies, to budgets of the municipal corporation meant for neutering and sterilizing dogs, and understanding the politics of all of this in the context of a changing urban neighborhood. And I'm saying this, I'm using this as an example because one of the least understood things is how, when we change the way in which built form works, it has very serious consequences for other non-human life in our cities. And so we see dogs getting aggressive. We don't understand why they're getting aggressive. We don't understand how to model their behavior. So this is what actually one of the interns did. We hoped for a long time that it'll turn into a PhD at some point of time. We're sure it'll, even now, that it'll turn into a PhD at some point. So with that quick introduction, I just want to walk through some of the images because each image will tell a very different story. So can we move to the next image? Okay, so this is a map of transit frequencies in the city. This actually started in a very interesting way. We had an engineering student who wanted to intern with us because he wanted to build a mobile phone app, smartphone app for informing people about when the next bus would arrive. And in 2013, we didn't even have a decent map of bus stops in the city. So usually what would happen when we tell new IT professionals who are coding, who are modeling, all of that kind of stuff, is that they back off and say that, look, we will do it only when we have data. Well, this student basically said that, why is it so difficult? Just a matter of walking on the streets and marking all of those bus stops on a paper map. So he went around a city of about 500 square kilometers and put 1,500 bus stops as pins on a paper map, and then digitized all of it, and then started modeling it to a point where, with putting in all of the data on the bus tickets that were being sold on a day-to-day basis, he pretty much figured out the highest density road transport, bus transport corridors in the city. Now, what that led to was this very interesting insight that the new swanky metropolitan, the metro rail in the city, which cost us an arm and a leg, was actually coming up all along those very corridors on which buses were already moving people, which basically meant that the new metro was not moving people from four-wheeler private transportation, that is cars, into the metro. It was actually moving large numbers of people who were traveling by very cheap buses into the more expensive metro rail. And then we started overlaying all kinds of other data that we already had with us, which is about the 1,400 odd slums in the city, to try and map out where the transit deserts in the city were. And what we found was something very interesting, which is that actually the city connected poorer neighborhoods very well with buses. And so we were very excited about this whole thing, and we started then showing these maps to people. And one of the first setback we had, which led to a lot of very interesting studies subsequently, was that women told us that, look, your idea that the city is very well connected is absolute nonsense, because women who have jobs as shop clerks, as nurses, as security guards in hospitals, as housekeeping staff in hotels, they all have to commute at very, very odd hours. And this city's public transportation is basically designed for office going public. So if you are a 9 to 5 job holder, the city works for you. But if you are a woman who has to go to a shop at 2 o'clock and work there till 10 o'clock and then get back home, the city's public transportation doesn't work. That then led to a lot of very interesting explorations subsequently, where we had to reinterrogate our own understanding of what is actually equity and fairness in public transportation. Can we move to the next one? Okay, this is another example of the kind of things that happened at HUL. We were trying to understand how incremental housing, auto construction, you can call it by any number of very different names, but it is essentially somebody starting to build a house from the scratch with maybe a little bit of a foundation, and then gradually building up from there over an entire generation, sometimes actually over 2 or 3 generations. So this was a house in which a family of washermen, traditional washermen, used to live. And when one of our researchers walked into the house trying to figure out how that house was actually built, what was the idiom, what was the grammar of that building's architecture, he found something very interesting, which is that the owner of the house had been collecting wedding cards in his community for the last 5 years. And he had something like 400 wedding cards. And when we asked this person why he was collecting all of those wedding cards, he said, look, I have girls and boys who are going to be of marriageable age very soon. And so I need to know what's happening within the community and I need to keep track. So here is where we have all of those cards telling me who's living where. So what we did was to take all of these wedding cards and they contain two addresses, right? One is the venue at which the wedding is taking place, and the other is the residential address of the bride or the groom. And so what we did is to put them on a map. And then because these are washermen, we were also curious about whether the residential patterns of these washermen had anything at all to do with the availability of water. And one of the ways in which we could think through that was to look at the contour map of the city so that we can actually figure out the drainage pattern and see if they were close to where the water is. Can you move to the next one? So there you have. On the right side, you see the platforms on which these traditional washermen wash clothes in the banks of a river. But on the left side, what you're seeing is the contours of the city on which you see clusters of washermen's houses. And what we find is that people moved from the river into higher and higher areas, but always moving to a place where there was some kind of a accumulation of water. Now, you must remember that Hyderabad city is a city in which within every square kilometer you have at least one water body, which was historically an irrigation tank, but increasingly it is turning into places of recreation, and sometimes it just turns into residential apartments. So what these communities were doing was to go constantly in search of new water around which they built houses. And that told us something very important about traditional occupations in the city and their place, and how those places were changing, how those houses were built, and so on. And so we then ended up doing a lot of documentation of incremental housing or auto construction from the point of view of the work done by people who live in those houses. Can you move to the next one? Okay, here is a map of Nanakramguda, which is the heart of what we call the financial district in the city. So, because many of you wouldn't be familiar with the city, Hyderabad city basically underwent a tremendous transformation starting from 2001 or 2002. Around that time, we built the western segment of the city as a place with very high-speed connectivity to Riverside, California, to a lot of the IT headquarters, particularly in the US, but also across Europe and so on. So this area, which eventually came to be known as Cyberabad, was small villages where the value of land shot through the sky in a matter of like 6 months, to the extent that we used to laugh about the way in which people who had nothing at all in terms of liquid cash in their hands day before yesterday would have sold their land yesterday, and today they were carrying money in literally in sacks to take with them to go home and go somewhere else and buy new land. So what we saw was a transformation of these traditional agricultural villages with ecological commons of various kinds, hills, water bodies, and so on. And what we did was to overlay the new financial district infrastructures, which would include multinational corporations, special economic zones, electrified fences of properties right next to older villages. And mapping these things and looking at these spatial transformations through time gave us a very, very rich understanding of migration patterns, of local customs changing, of the tensions that were emerging, and how in the end actually local governance was something which is impossible to manage at the local level, because it's just too complex for anyone to understand. It can only be now managed at the highest level through some sort of a club of IT companies, and that's the only way in which it can operate. So these are maps of places like that. Can we move to the next? Yeah, this is a continuation of the same map, and I can share these things with you later if you want. Next. Okay, this is another segment where we did a lot of work in the recent past, and we're continuing to actually do some work in this area where we're trying to understand how residential areas which are off the grid, that is, they may have piped water supply but not very satisfactory. They may have a sewage connection, but the sewer mains is too narrow and too thin to handle all of the sewage that is coming out. So in some sense, they are actually just not fitting anywhere into the grid through which services are rendered to neighborhoods. We're looking at how these areas actually end up spending a lot more money. We are looking at how they are able to or not able to deal with rising temperatures in the summer, dealing with disasters like small local floods that happen in the monsoon, and so on and so forth. One of the reasons why we focus on this area is that you see in the left corner of this, this is the straight map actually. So you're looking at north at the top and west at the left. So you see this tank, which is at the bottom of a hill. It's at the foot of a hill, and on top of it you see the pink colored pink orange kind of thing. That is actually a massive slum with about 18 clusters inside it, which developed in the last 20 years. And above that, you have one of the most expensive residential areas, the green area of Hyderabad city, which is called the Film Nagar. And that's where some of the richest people in the city live. It's almost like the Hollywood of Hyderabad. Now, what has happened is with the very rapid occupation of all of these lands, the hill slopes through which the water would come into that tank-like thing at the bottom, that entire thing has now been completely blocked off. So the only water that reaches that tank now is sewage. And we were introduced to this area by the municipal corporation itself, which asked us to see if there is any way we can make sure that some kind of clean water would be held by the tank. And we came to the conclusion that it's actually impossible unless we set up a sewage treatment plant north of that reservoir. But that is not possible because we just don't have land for it. So the only thing that can eventually be done, if at all, is to either turn this into a sewage treatment plant by itself, or we completely divert all of the water that is coming from the hill slopes into another canal and turn this into an artificial reservoir, which has to be filled with water that you bring from somewhere else, right? So you look at the bizarre challenges of changing the terrain of the city, because we just haven't figured out how to make land available for housing for different social groups. So this is one area where we have been tracking a lot of the changes that are happening over a period of time. Next one. So this is actually a section drawing of the same area, of what I showed you. What you see in the drawing above is on the left side is where the north of the tank is, right? So the high-rise buildings at the top, the slums on the hill slopes, and then the water body at the bottom. And then on the right side is where you have, again, more expensive housing. So basically what happens is the hill slopes, which are supposed to be the ecological commons, which cannot actually be in any way owned as private property by anyone, is the only area that is available for poor people to go and occupy. and build housing there, and then slowly claim tenurial rights to continue to live there. Yeah. So in the left side photograph, you see exactly that if you are looking at it from the top of the hill. Next. These is some of the housing along the hill slope, where the government finally said, look, it makes no sense for us to stop these people from coming in. We may as well build some government housing here for the poor. And that's what the housing actually looks like. Next. That's it, no? Yeah. So I didn't want to really walk you through all of the work that we do, but this is the kind of stuff that we have been doing over the years, and the many different kinds of things. Neema, do we have time to play that video, the YouTube video?
Dhruv, have you lined that video up? So while Dhruv is lining the video up, Anant, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit more about why you started the Hyderabad Urban Lab. Right? So not just about the what, but the why. Yeah.
So the idea of the lab actually began, I think, in a very seed form in 2004 when I was in grad school. And the thing that I must admit is that I actually didn't go to grad school imagining that I would do anything in the urban. I was very interested in understanding how property relationships were managed in India's forests. I'd spent a lot of time looking at revenue enclaves, that is the villages deep inside forest, and the conflicts that were taking place in the forest area because the government was not willing to recognize the rights of people who were living in the forest. But when I started school, one of the things that began to happen, I think you're actually search for sneak peek, 2 din. So I sent it as a link to you, 2 din sneak peek. I sent it as a link to you in the email in which I sent the pictures also. But 2018. It should say sneak peek. This one, the second one. The second one.
But before we play it, Anant, you want to just finish?
Yeah, I'll finish my thought.
Yeah.
So what happened was in 2004, I began. I chanced upon working in a project which was looking at how cities in Western Europe and North America had changed. Not so much from a policy angle, but from the point of view of workers, from the point of view of communities, from the point of view of collective bargaining, and so on. And that led me to wonder whether the kinds of questions that we were asking about cities and communities in the context of the pretty much decimation of large-scale manufacturing in these cities was still the same thing that would apply in cities in the global south. I wasn't sure at all that it will work in Hyderabad. So that was the time when a number of us began to think about what kinds of questions do we need to ask in the global south. So this is like 2000 to 2003, which is roughly the time when Jennifer was working on ordinary cities. Ash had written about ordinary cities. So there were a range of thoughts, all of them pointing in the same direction, that there is something going on in cities of the global south that is very easily missed if we look at it through the categories through which we are used to looking at cities in Western Europe and North America. And that basically meant that we needed to figure out ways of embedding ourselves in the reality of cities in the global south and start thinking about building concepts from there. So that's the starting of the idea, which then got crafted more and more as I went through my PhD, and then got involved in a number of regional conversations, which happened in Shenzhen, which happened in Jakarta, which happened in Minnesota. And by 2008, 2009, some of us were very clear that it's very important to try and figure out how to think about cities from the global south by planting ourselves inside of those cities. And for us, for me, that meant that Hyderabad was the place where I would have to do that, basically because many people don't realize this, but India was not uniformly colonized by the British. Hyderabad actually didn't even become independent on August 15th, 1947. It remained most faithful ally to the British until 1948, September 17th, when India marched upon Hyderabad. And that basically meant that the city has a very different sense of modernization, a very different arc of development. And that's what we needed to figure out. So that's how Hyderabad Urban Lab came together, with a group of people from very different backgrounds, but with some shared interest in the city, either because there was an intellectual curiosity, or because there was a political project, or because there was a methodological commitment. So it was a network of people who came together to establish the lab in 2012. And then it kind of went through a number of transformations.
Brilliant. I want to pick up on the political question and the planning question, but perhaps we watch the video first.
Yeah.
Okay. Dhruv, you want to run the video? Where's the sound?
The audio is not working.
Yo.
It's a nice audio.
I know. I told you, we always have these.
All right. So maybe people can watch it later. Because I mean, without the audio, this is not fun.
Eric? Hello, Eric. Is there a way to connect this to the speakers?
Is this okay? This one's working. So Anant, you talked about how different groups of people came together for methodological reasons, for, they had different kinds of projects in mind, right? And in that was thrown the question of politics and activism as well. And so I was wondering if you could link out or think through a little bit for us the relationships between doing the kind of work the HUL does and the politics of the city, planning in the city, and governance in the city.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the ways in which a friend of mine who spends an equal amount of time in North American cities as he does in Hyderabad and in several other Indian cities, once said, put this very nicely, he said that, you ask me in New York on whose backs is this city built, I can tell you, these are the 5 groups. You ask me in Hyderabad on whose backs is this city built, I'm lost because I just cannot tell you. There are so many different groups, so many different ways in which this breaks down, and we don't know exactly how to build a coherent politics. And I think that is the nature of the post-colonial polity, which in one of the essays that I co-authored with my PhD advisors, we actually describe it as these are places where the burden of history is borne by the majority of the people, and that's what it really is all about. That these are cities in which you dig and you dig and you dig and you keep finding continuities and discontinuities in histories of various kinds. So there is no easy way in which we can think about collective bargaining in places like this. I mean, not even in the sense in which you can say that, okay, so the immigrant worker, the taxi driver, the janitor becomes the fulcrum of worker mobilization in the US at some point of time. You can't even say anything like that in a city like Hyderabad or Delhi or Bangalore or Dhaka. There's something else going on here. What that something else is can only be figured out if we know how to break down the categories through which we are looking at what's going on here. And I think that one useful way in which that has been framed for us earlier on was Kalyan Sanyal's work on how in a number of these cities, you see people who are kicked out of the rural areas landing up in the city and engaging in two different kinds of economies, right? One economy of subsistence and the other economy of some sort of accumulation. This group of people who are engaged in subsistence economy are organized by caste, by religion, by ethnic identities of various kinds, which is where the saturated of history actually lies. So the politics that we were trying to figure out in Hyderabad was precisely around this, that who are these people? What is the arc of modernization here? What is the kind of collectives that are operating in the city? And when we began to dig into that, some of the things that we realized over time by repeatedly going back to the same sites is that this thing called the informal economy, this thing called the unorganized sector, is actually very beautifully and very deeply organized. It's organized through very long, very rich histories of caste mobilization, of regional mobilization. They are organized through networks of lending money to each other. They're organized through marriage, all sorts of things. And this is where our work actually began, because one of the first things that happened was when we were beginning to start our work in Hyderabad, there was an area which which had a long, a century and a half history of being a scrap market. It started in the 1860s as a leather tanning center, which was where all of the leather from the entire Hyderabad region's meat-eating populations was landing up. From there, it was going into the British Army's manufacturing facilities, where it would be turned into saddles, it will be turned into holsters, it will be turned into bags of various kinds and so on. Gradually, by 1980s, all of this begins to shut down. Because of transportation, other networks become possible. Because of competition from China, India is no longer able to deal with leather products in the same way, all kinds of stuff like that. But in the end, what actually happened is a population of about 40,000 people living in one municipal block. Almost all of them moved from leather tanning into dealing with plastic. Right? So from carcasses of animals, you're moving into carcasses of consumer products of various kinds. And at some point of time, there was very serious fecal matter contamination of drinking water. Several people died. And the real estate that was developing in the area was trying to push out these people. And they basically argued that all of this was happening because of the polluting industry. And the population there was arguing back, saying that E. coli does not come from plastic pollution. It comes from fecal matter. Tell us where it has come from. And we decided to jump in and add our voice to that. That's how it began. So we started then tracing the circuits of waste. Where does material come from? Where does it go? How is the sewage in the area organized? So we basically then started cutting through the place, trying to gain more and more deeper understanding of the place. And that meant that we had to also overcome very deep mistrust that people had in the area for anything that had to do with academic world. They basically told us that if you want to do something for your university, you want to write a paper, you want to get your degree, you want to teach your students, we are happily will give you data. Don't look for the truth, because if the truth is in your hands, we don't trust you what you're going to do with it. They just flatly refused to tell us what was going on. And it took us about 6 months of time to persuade them that we were not going away, that we were not from the university to write PhD thesis or whatever. We may be doing some part of it at some point of time, but in the end, we were not going to go away from that place. It's this long-term commitment to a place which actually changed the balance between us and the local community, which I think is fundamental to a lot of the work that we do in HUL. That is, we are there in a place for the long term. We are not going away. And that essentially means then that we are not parachuting in to any place. We build long-term relationships. We don't promise a whole lot of things. We may end up actually not giving them anything except a good patient hearing. And what we realized over time is that one of the things that people valued a lot is the fact that we listen, that we are willing to listen to stories with some empathy, that we are willing to interpret those stories and give it back to them so that they can then figure out how to put those stories to work. So it's this cultural work, is this work of telling stories, whether we use maps, whether we use data that we are generating, whether we are doing high-end algorithm writing, whatever we are doing. Ultimately, this is what it comes down to, that we are telling stories about people, and we do it through building relationships of trust on some sort of an equal basis. And we begin with this idea that we may be screwing up what's going on, but we are not going to run away from what we have done. And that has changed the relationship. So broadly, the politics that we are talking about is politics of habitation, of being rooted in a place, acting as if you are rooted. You may eventually go away somewhere else, but you've got to trust yourself and everybody else that you're here together in this, and that's what matters. So the video that I was going to show you, actually, I hope you will see it at some point of time on YouTube, is an annual event that we do. And that annual event is basically one where we bring together people of very, very different kinds. So you have filmmakers, poets, musicians, artists, activists, social scientists, everybody comes there. And we spend 2 whole days in very intense interactions with each other. So some of it looks like academic, a lot of it is just not academic at all. And that's what the event is. And we call it Do Din, which simply means 2 days. 2 days of hanging together. It's become a home for many people now. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Anant. There's so much joy in it, right? And I
It's
think
great
that's
fun.
the joy of collaboration. And you talked so evocatively about a place-based politics of habitation, you called it, and a place-based practice, right? I'm wondering whether, I'm thinking of our students here and thinking of planning as a profession, which is like all modern professions, claims a kind of expertise that is rooted in building a set of skills and divorced actually from place, because it's a transferable set of expertise that you can carry from the United States into China, into India, and you spend a lot of money studying these transferable skill sets. So, which is not completely at odds with the kind of practice you're talking about, but it works in slightly different ways in the world. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, right? How does one think about the modern professional, the planner, in the context of a place-based politics of habitation?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So one of the things that I think we often miss in this whole debate is what kinds of skills does place itself give you, and how do you transfer those skills, right? So one of the things that we've been actually concerned about in the last 4 or 5 years is what we are calling tacit knowledge in the urban. And just to give you 2 or 3 very, very different kinds of examples, you cannot write a manual on how a nurse should be giving an injection, right? A nurse can only learn to give an injection by watching someone else do it, by poking the needle 2 or 3 times, and that's how she's going to learn. It cannot be transferred by the textbook. There are things that people call intuition, which basically comes from having done things repeatedly over a period of time. There are cultural sensibilities that come to you because you have spent enough time in a place and learned how to read the neighborhood, learned how to read the built environment, learned how to read the way in which people transact with each other, all of these kinds of things. If we do not teach our planners, if we do not teach our architects, if we do not teach our social scientists, and I'm not actually singling out any single profession in this because I see this happening in all disciplines, in all schools, not just in the US, but actually even in India, that people have over time learned to distrust all these other modes of learning from places. And therefore, what happens is that you have people who are actually incapable of reading what's happening in a place because they just don't have the skills of interpreting what is going on, of sensing what's going on, of using non-verbal modes of communication, which could be visual, which could be simply through practice, all kinds of things, right? In the sociology of science, you call this tacit knowledge, that is knowledge which is in excess of what you can tell. I mean, every scientist, whether from chemical technology to advanced physics, knows that there is something about the knowledge that they work with which is in excess of what they can put into words. And I think that even in very large new knowledge industries, this has become a huge problem for many people, because over the years, if there are people who have worked in your organization for 5 years or 6 years, they walk away, they're actually walking away with your intellectual capital, knowledge that has never been reduced to any kind of codified form. So what do you do? What kinds of new cultures can you build? I think that what Hyderabad Urban Lab has been attempting to do over the years is basically try and figure out how do we do this transfer of skills that cannot be about codified knowledge. And I think that's an area in which we really need to have a lot of conversations. If
Yeah.
we do that, I think we can actually figure out how planners can work much, much better, much more effectively. Because in the end, what are the kinds of plans that we're making? I mean, we've been looking at so many different master plans, which actually, where existing land use has nothing at all to do with what actually exists on the ground.
Right. So this kind of applies back. Am I? I'm not. What's going on?
And I can't hear you.
Andre or Eric, whoever's
Your voice is very weak. It's kind of distant.
now. Can you hear me now?
Slightly better.
Okay. I'm just going to shove this thing inside my mouth and hope for the best. Hang on, sorry, Anna. I told you. The challenge. The land of the technologists. Okay, Anant. So
Now I can hear you.
Okay, great. But I can't see you now, but that's okay. Oh, I can
Oh.
see you. You're right here in front of me. And you're above
Yes.
me, in front of me. You're like one devta. All
I
over.
can say.
Okay. So Anant, I want to just push this place-based conversation a little bit more and the codification of knowledge, right? So what I find, one of the something that you've been sort of talking about quite a bit through this little time that we've been here is collaboration and how different groups of people come together in the HUL to really sort of think through and work through the experience of the city, right? And to respond to the kinds of challenges that people living in Hyderabad face. And so, when we think about expertise-based knowledge and institutions that are built around expertise, the argument often is that they can scale up, collaborate to meet problems that are not just based in one place, climate change, for example, that are worldwide, that have different kinds of impacts. And so I was wondering if you would speak again to how this sort of politics of habitation, a place-based practice, kind of works in that sort of mentality or thinking around how we address global problems.
Yeah. I must say that some of my understanding of the scaling up thing comes from a slightly older era of developmental practice. In the 90s, I used to often be in these development consultations, which are often internationally funded, about how you build a small model and then you scale it up, and that scaled up solution should work across territory. And what this essentially means is that you're looking for covering a larger territory with the same model and going up in the hierarchy of state to work from the top to be able to give a policy direction that applies to that entire territory. And I think that this approach of scaling up through a territorial approach, through the imagination that somehow you go up vertically to see larger territory below and apply the same thing across that territory. We've seen how it has failed so completely, so miserably over time. I think it's important for us to remember that it is very, very necessary that we speak to each other, that we can replicate what is happening in one place in another place. We should be able to multiply. We should be able to enact things from one place to another. But all of this, maybe even one could argue to some extent that you need some sort of an enabling structure at the top that will allow all of this to happen. But anything beyond that, anything beyond creating that large, very large enabling framework, to get to the details, is going to end up in a disaster, because in the end, what will happen is what you have planned for a larger territory through that scaled up thing is going to be interpreted by people locally, and something else will emerge there. So you think that you have given recipe A, and that maybe it with some variations it will become C in a local place, but actually what emerges there is Z or O or P or Q. You just don't know what's going to happen. And I think the scary thing is that we don't know why things happen the way they do. And therefore, my argument is that we need to find ways of building collaborations across places, translations across places, so that we can find ways of meaningfully holding conversations across all of these places, which is precisely what happens at this event, Dodin, right? We have people coming in from Calcutta, from Delhi, from Bombay, from Chennai, to talk about things that matter to them. And each of them then goes away from the event truly inspired by new ideas. And a lot of things do get replicated. They just don't get done in the form of saying that, okay, so here we have a plan for South India or for all India. I think somewhere the challenge really lies in the fact that there is a nation state imagination of planning, of work of planning itself being deeply implicated in the work of the state, which it's time we began to question that a little bit. Yeah. I'm not saying that you can get away or should get away from the state. I'm not someone who would argue that the state needs to be ignored, but I do think that to imagine that the state is where your salvation lies is a bit of a very, very limiting thing.
Especially perhaps in India, in some ways. Maybe in America too, right now. So I do think, we've landed this conversation in a place where we are at sort of thinking through the transformation of the state, but also as the planning profession as being so deeply entwined with the politics of nation building and the state. And so that's something which, many of us think quite a bit about, right? Because it opens up questions of the ways in which planning can be a rather oppressive practice, or has been sort of entwined in certain kinds of oppressive practices practiced by states. But I'll stop there because I'm also keeping an eye on time. So Anant, thank you. So you and I have been sort of on this conversation now, really taking the sort of HUL, the Hyderabad Urban Lab, as an example of a place-based practice that opens up certain kinds of questions, that works across certain binaries. The most important one being that one set of people have to do research and another set of people have to do practice, right? You're talking about a practice that is rooted in place-based research and a research that is rooted in the politics of habitation in place and in practice. So I really, I think that breaking that binary becomes so important for those of us who wish to practice a certain kind of planning. Now, what I'm going to do in the last half hour that we have, or a little less than the last half hour, is open up questions for for everyone who's here. And so they can bring their questions to you around these topics that you've been sort of, working through with us. So anyone, questions? If you don't mind coming down, or maybe Dhruv, that thing works.
Hello,
Sure.
can you hear me?
Works.
Can you hear? Hello?
Yes,
Anant?
we can hear you.
Okay,
I can
great.
hear you.
Any questions on this mic will be heard.
So we'll just take some questions, Anant.
Sure.
Hello, thank you, Anant. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Jimbo. I'm a student from CRP. And my question is, so just now you mentioned a lot about place-based research and the practice. So I want to know, and you also mentioned that cooperation with a lot of expertise from other fields. So my question is that I want to know how this kind of organization, place-based organization, how they cooperate with different levels of official departments or governments. So yeah, I want to know more experience about that. Thank you.
Okay. Neema, do you want me to answer each question as it comes, or should we take 2 or 3 and then should I respond them at one go?
Let's take 2 or 3 because I see a couple of other hands. So Hantao. And after Hantao, if there's another question, so Anant has 3 questions to work through.
Yeah, hi, Anant, thanks for this presentation. I'm a little bit curious about what you just say about the role of the planner, because and the researcher as well, because what you just described, how you work with the neighborhoods, it's almost like the least disturbing way I've ever seen, because it's almost like observation, right? You are not like really participating in their life, but more read them and try to make them be seen in the map, and kind of metaphorically speaking, let them speak, right? Because originally they are not speaking to the world, and right now you kind of like drag them to speak to the public. So this seems to be there is a presumption here, like they somehow willing to be seen, and there's a need for them to be seen by the world, or a need of this place to be produced, to formulate a new knowledge. So I kind of wonder, like, this expulsion, are they moral? Or to put it another way, Spivak once asked, like, can the subaltern speak? I'm wondering, should the subaltern speak? See, if their practice are theorized, and then they are seen in a map, and their actions are exposed and acknowledged, and I can imagine the policies afterwards maybe formalize their informal behaviors. So is that necessary, or to put it, is that moral? I don't know. Yeah. Just curious.
Anant, I think we should stop with those 2 questions, because you have the big moral question of boy and empowerment, right? The difficult word of empowerment, which is so misused. And then the other question, which is how do you work across deeply hierarchical, large governmental systems, the first one. So the moral question, I think, appears in both, right?
Yeah. Okay, so let me start with the question about how do we work with the state. I'll have to first say that the government and not the state, state as an abstract set of rules and institutions that are governed by those rules is a slightly different game altogether. The government, which then implies things like the communities, the groups of people, the ethnic identities, the classes of people who come into power, whom in an earlier era we would very happily call ruling classes. They're very mistrustful of the people. They don't want to trust people. They don't want to pay a lot of attention to them, because people are scary creatures. You know, you let them bring their ideas into to how the government should be run, you're going to have havoc. That's the way in which governments actually see people. So what happens very often is that a place like Hyderabad Urban Lab or our work is of some curiosity to governments. They watch us, they listen to us, they sometimes actually seek our help. They ask us to come and demonstrate. They're surprised why somebody outside of the city takes us seriously. They marvel at our ability to do certain things without any resources, and they keep asking us for help. They keep track of what we do, and I think that's the most interesting thing. That I mean, in the era of social media, the kind of things that we do, we talk about, it's there all over the place, and governments do keep an eye on what we are saying. And I think that the influence that you have on governments often comes from these kinds of osmotic effects. It doesn't come from a direct engagement, because in a direct engagement, actually, the agenda is led by someone else, and actually not even by someone else, by larger forces that you don't have a whole lot of control on. So what we do is to keep some kind of a respectable distance from various levels of government. We don't shun them, we don't reject them, we engage with them, but engage with them at some degree of aloofness. And that has worked quite well for us, because it gives us the ability to work according to our own time horizons without getting compromised. And we are respected. People take us seriously. They may not do exactly what we suggest needs to be done, but they do take us seriously, and they do pick up some parts of what we talk about. The second question actually in some ways actually relates to the first one, which is that if the government is there at one level, then that government comes right down to the level of a neighborhood, because that is where you have your local engineer, that is where you have your local power lineman, that's where you have the guy who walks around the neighborhood, opens taps, shuts off valves, ensures that there is some kind of an equitable distribution of water to the entire neighborhood, right? All of this kind of everyday craft of running the government actually happens. In this place, the people and the government are all very, very intricately mixed up. And it's in that space, what do we do? I think one of the ways in which we have understood Spivak's line, "Can the subaltern speak?" As a provocation, which is not actually about the subaltern, but about the non-subaltern. That is, may I speak, right? Are you willing to listen? Do you have the capacity to listen? And I think a large part of the trouble is that we have lost our ability to listen. We have put ourselves in structures from where it becomes very difficult for us to listen, and we need to retrain ourselves to do that. So in that sense, listening to the lineman who gets up in the morning at 5 o'clock when the prayer call happens, walks around neighborhoods, shutting off valves, opening valves, resolving local conflicts. From there to the engineer who can decide whether you should do this or not, whether the truck should go there or here. These kinds of everyday parts of the governmental work are very important for a city. They are not about very large ideas about democracy. They are about what becomes possible for people to articulate at a local level. And I think there, as much as we think about our work as planning, visualizing, etc., a lot of it is also about putting stories into circulation. What stories actually can travel, what do not travel, what become visible, what become audible, and how do we as planners, as geographers, influence those processes is what we need to think through. One of the additional things that HUL has begun to do, which goes against your understanding that we are minimalist in our intervention in neighborhoods. We actually have been during the lockdown, began to make small interventions, physical interventions in neighborhoods. And we've done one. We are thinking that we will actually do in the coming 1 year a bunch of experimental interventions in neighborhoods to see how we can figure out local negotiation. So basically, what we did is there's a hill slope neighborhood And a group of students worked on how to create some kind of a social space in that neighborhood, which is also addressing problems of dealing with excess drainage of water. So they created an engineering infrastructure, which is basically a staircase that comes down from the top of the hill to the edge of the houses, thereby creating a new social space between those houses. So now you go there in the morning around 7 o'clock, you see all of the women in those houses sitting on those staircases, talking with each other, getting their kids ready for school. A completely new social life has emerged in that neighborhood, which was unimaginable barely 2 years ago. I mean, the stunning impact of this is captured in just two anecdotes that I want to share. One old man who lived at the top of the hill came down the staircase of about 30 stairs, and with a bright smile told his students on the third day that, you know, my friend lives at the foot of this hill. I've been living there at the top. For the last 8 years, I haven't seen him. Today, for the first time, I have come down to meet him. Right? And then there was this other guy who said that, look, I've been living in this neighborhood for the last 7 years. I've been trying to get married, but nobody wants to marry me because my house is so inaccessible. Now with this staircase, it actually becomes possible for me to imagine a decent prospect of getting married. He actually got married in 2 months' time. I'm not kidding. These two stories for us are very, very important because they became possible through a lot of local negotiations that involved municipal officials, elected representatives, jealous neighbors, people who would steal away concrete and steel and construction material, all sorts of problems. But you had to work through that. And the point is that maybe there is something to be said for making these kinds of interventions in a significant number of locations, whereby through an osmotic pressure, it will actually begin to scale up by itself. Right? You don't scale it up by saying that here is my area plan. What you do is to create some sort of an acupressure that builds networks which are capillary, not easily visible. People get inspired, people want to talk about it, and then start actually mimicking things. And I think that these processes of mimicry are things that we don't pay a lot of attention to when we think about scaling up or whether the subaltern can speak or not. I think there are processes that are silent. They look like they're not speaking, but they do. And we need to pay attention to those.
We have time for a last question. Somebody has some? Swati. Anant, one last question before we wrap up.
Sure.
Thank you for your presentation. So you said that efforts of scaling up has failed spectacularly, but I was just wondering if you've seen or like done any that have succeeded to some extent, because like, are there exceptions to this fact of like having a top-down approach which has like succeeded, that has not succeeded, which you think could be like an example that other places can follow, especially because as planners, we do have to sometimes work on like top-down approaches and things like that. So yeah, if you have any examples.
I'm not for one moment suggesting that top-down policy making should be abandoned. And I have to say this after saying that top-down planning has failed spectacularly in many places. To correct the impression that kind of a phrasing gives. I think what actually happens is that when you do planning from the top, it will have consequences that you often are not prepared for. And that is because you, particularly in the global south, policy and planning is actually done more in practice. It's like we often, I'm just right now teaching an advanced level course on cities to a group of lawyers, law students, and we often debate this question of whether the law actually exists on paper or whether the law is what it is because of it is law in motion, in practice, right? Policy is very often what it is in practice. It is not what it looks like on paper. And I think that one of the skills that every planning student, every policy student must learn is that what you put down on paper goes out to people, gets translated into practice by them in so many different places, in so many different ways. And it's only when you have the sensibility to know what it is and write your policy and configure the practice in such a way that you're least surprised. Because if you are surprised, sometimes it is a pleasant surprise, sometimes it's a nasty surprise. And I think very often we are met by nasty surprises when you don't know what you're doing. So examples of things that might have worked, I think Swachh Bharat mission worked. It worked to not 90% or 100% as it has been claimed. It worked, I think, to something like 50%. And I think that figuring out why it worked for that from 20% to 50%, that additional numbers got added in a meaningful and effective way, but the remaining actually did not get added. We've just been imagining that they have been done. But what happened on the ground is that people built storerooms, they built pantries, they did not build toilets. What happened on the ground is that they may have built toilets, but that may have at the most given them privacy, but ended up giving them public health risks. And none of that has actually ever been thought through in the policy. And so when it hits as a disaster, it is a really bad one. And the way in which we often do things, we insulate ourselves from that knowledge coming back to us. So in the worst possible form of working with knowledge coming in the opposite direction, which is democratic centralism, that is people at the bottom report back to you, and then you can sit at the top and take decisions. We don't even have democratic centralism in most cases, because there are so many circuits through which information actually doesn't come right to the top. It gets interpreted, it gets disrupted, it gets stopped, all of that. So limited success, I think Swachh Bharat actually worked in many places. The trouble is that we don't know where it worked and where it did not work. And that's what I'm urging people to do.
Thank you, Anant. So Swachh Bharat, for those of you who are not familiar with the Indian policy context, was it translates to Clean India. And it was a massive program that was rolled out nationally with huge targets for everybody to get toilets, new infrastructure, etc. And it's been, as Anant was pointing out, a rather vexed kind of situation, but successful in some places. And so I'm keeping an eye on time here. Anant, if you had some last comments to just sort of, throw our way for an audience that has come here to study how to change the world and to change the cities where they are going to go back to and live, that'd be great. And then I can give you a thanks after that.
I will say what I often say to students who are starting on their work in the field. One of the things that we often teach anyone who comes to work at HUL, even for a very brief period, is to ask them to make maps of the places they walk through. They make maps. And when making maps, we ask them to talk to a few people who are supposed to be in those places which are being put on map. So maps then get populated not by points, lines, and polygons, which of course will have to be there, but by people. And when they put people on those maps, the problem of who's observing whom becomes very, very real for them for the first time ever. Very often they go into the field, come back, imagining that they went out and observed people. And it's almost always comes as a big surprise to them to know that they were walking in the field with one pair of eyes, but there were 50 pairs of eyes which were actually observing them. Right? So when you come back and sit down and look at your map, when you come back and sit down and think about the data that you brought back, one of the first questions that you have to ask yourself is, what did I look like to other people? What is the information that I picked up from the field? Why did I pick up that bit of information rather than some other bit of information, right? So in some sense, what actually happens is that you imagine that you're walking out into the field, into the world, to learn about the world. But when you come back and sit down and start looking at what you brought back, actually you have a very rich material on your hands, which teaches you about yourself. And I think that that self-reflexivity, which Gayatri Spivak calls for, which all practice should teach us, is what is really, really important for every one of us to learn. Because if we don't know how we are seen by people, why we are seeing what we are seeing, if we don't track down what is not said, what is not heard in the field, but is very much present there, then we are actually going to mess with the world. So your first task should be to figure out what is it that you're picking up in that multitude of information. So to quote Edward Said in Orientalism, who quotes in turn Antonio Gramsci, he basically says that the history leaves an infinity of traces in each of us, but it doesn't give you an inventory. You don't have a catalog. And the task of your work, of critical elaboration, is to compile such an inventory. Right? You need to create that catalog. Why are you picking up these bits of information rather than those bits of information? Why are you organizing them in this pattern rather than in those patterns? That's what you need to think about. And that means that you need to think about how planning categories themselves come into being and what power do they have, how do they work. This is the sort of stuff that you need to learn over time to work with. If you do that, I think all of you will make a huge difference to the way in which the world works. Thank you so much for being here and listening to me.
That was just beautiful, Anand. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining. I know it's really late, but 11 o'clock now at night for you. So
11:30. That's
11:30. So we appreciate very much you joining us, participating and provoking us with these questions. Thank you. And we hope to see you in person in Ithaca one day.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. We'll just end it now. Thanks, everybody. See you next Friday. And I hope you attend all 10 of the meetings.
I don't have control.
Yeah. Bye, Anand.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah. See you in Hyderabad, hopefully. Bye.
Yes. Bye-bye.